Hello and welcome to So Now What with Gates Cambridge, a podcast tackling some of the world's wicked problems with those who are dedicated to doing something about them. I'm Catherine Galloway, and my guests, as always, are Gates Cambridge scholars working to make an impact in the lives of others. 2024 is a democracy whopper. More than 70 countries will have held nationwide elections by the end of this year, with over half the global population, or 4.2 billion people, called to vote. As The Economist noted recently, it's a world first, but what sounds like it should be a triumphant year for democracy will, the magazine says, be the opposite. Many of these elections will be neither free nor fair. Many of these voters, disillusioned by the status quo, are digging deeper into the extremes. President Emmanuel Macron of France called it, ordering snap parliamentary elections a mere hour after the far-right National Rally won every region in the European elections in June, imploring the French to assume their responsibilities and reject extremism. And then, of course, there's November the 5th. Deep division in the United States could bring a second presidential term for Donald Trump and a host of geopolitical consequences for the rest of us. But change doesn't just come at the ballot box. My guests today are all looking inside and beyond themselves for answers to this year's hottest topic: how can we strengthen political legitimacy in a polarised world? Joining me on Zoom today, I'm delighted to welcome Lior Zmigrod, a member of the 2016 Gates Cambridge cohort, and Ayala Paniewski, Gates Cambridge class of 2018, both speaking from London. And then dialing in from his PhD fieldwork in Abuja, Nigeria, a warm welcome to Promise Frank Ejiofor, who began his Gates Cambridge journey in 2022. Thank you all very much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Now, looking at your academic journeys, you might think we're all coming at this from opposite, if not polarised, angles, and yet clearly you all hold human connection and consideration of other viewpoints as your North Star. Lior, your first book, The Ideological Brain, The Radical Science of Flexible Thinking, prompted a 13-way bidding war among publishers in the UK and will be released by Viking early next year. You're a neuroscientist, fascinated by how political beliefs change our brains and how, crucially, we could think our way out of extremism. You've advised policymakers in the US, the UK, and at the United Nations, appear on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in science, and have received a Woman of the Future Science Award. You can be found presenting your research everywhere, from Time magazine and the BBC to the Hay Festival and TEDx. Ayala, you're a journalist turned sociologist, investigating the rise of populist campaigns against the media and how journalists adapt to them. In 2022, former BBC journalist and podcast host Emily Maitlis discussed your findings in her keynote lecture at the Edinburgh TV Festival, warning the press must not give in to self-censorship. Growing up in Israel under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, you experienced the climate of media bashing well before Donald Trump's cry of fake news became global, and you have since highlighted its effects in Turkey, India, and beyond, arguing that upholding press freedom is key to a non-polarised world. Your first book, The New Censorship, will be out early next year with Footnote Press. And Promise, you're now completing a PhD in development studies at Cambridge, an intellectual journey that has taken you from philosophy through international relations, politics and social anthropology, and a geographical one that saw you leave Nigeria for Ghana, Azerbaijan, Hungary, Austria, and then the UK and back to Nigeria. Along the way, you've developed some clear ideas about what it takes to be what you call interconnected humans, and how education and research, when tied closely to the views and experiences of people on the ground, can lead to political, social and moral change for the better. Your work's already been published in leading journals, including the Review of African Political Economy and Ethnopolitics. So here we are, coming together to talk in the midst of conspiracy theories, cancel culture, disinformation, and deep global anxiety. If we're going to pull back from this, particularly in an election year as important as this one, it's going to take everything in our toolbox. So to get us started, I'd love you all to tell me one thing that you're bringing to the table today. Lior, let's start with you.
So as a psychologist and neuroscientist, what I'll be bringing today might be a little unconventional. I'll be bringing a kind of metaphorical microscope. Because while the issue of political legitimacy might seem to be only a sociological or historical or political issue at first blush, it's not actually only a collective social phenomenon, it also entails psychological and cognitive components. So, as today we're going to interrogate all the different meanings and implications, and maybe even the dark underbellies of political legitimacy, I'll be interested in bringing a psychological lens that asks what it means to have faith in political institutions, as well as what happens to our ideologies and our minds when we don't have that faith.
Thank you very much. So we've got a microscope and a microphone on the table already. Ayala, what are you bringing for us?
So I'm bringing the question, how to make sure we know who is the winner of the next elections and the next elections and the next elections. And it might sound obvious to some of us who are based in certain countries around the world, but as recent history shows us, this is not as trivial as it might initially seem. And this might require action on the part of all of us and a revolution in our information environment so that we are sure that after the next elections and the next one, we all know who won the elections. And when the next pandemic breaks, we all know that it happened and what to do against it. So I would say we should all rethink about our role in the information world we now live in. And I'm hoping to bring us some tools to cope with that.
And there speaks a true journalist. Thank you very much indeed, Ayala. What about you, Promise?
So, given my exhaustion with the Eurocentric framing of global political problems, I am bringing today an African perspective inflected by my uniquely Nigerian sensibilities to ruminate on the nature of political legitimacy in the world today.
Thank you very much indeed, Promise. So we're taking a much wider lens, perhaps, than traditional discussion of this kind of thing or Western-centric discussion of ideology and polarization traditionally has. Lior, if we can dig into this a little bit more, it's not just politics, is it? Because ideological thinking can be found in many different places. It's climate deniers, it's anti-vaxxers, it's religious fundamentalists. It can be found in any debate on race and sexuality. But to understand why it's so prevalent and why it's so prevalent now, can you explain the sort of comfort that polarized views bring to us and to our brains?
I think that the kind of comfort that ideological explanations give is that they're often very total in the sense that they are they have their own inner logic. That means that if you believe the premise, the rest of the consequences all flow seemingly naturally from it. It might not be the actual case that all of an ideological system's logic is faultless and rational, but when you are in it, it gives you kind of a coherent sense of reality. It gives you a sense of why we are here, whether that's in the context of the natural world, the political world, or social world, our spiritual lives. And it gives us a sense of where to go. So I often think about ideological thinking as both describing a state of the world and prescribing human action. And given the chaotic world in which we live with all kinds of ambiguities, having a sense of certainty and coherence is hugely valuable for brains that are constantly trying to predict the world, to anticipate what's coming next. So ideologies as these kind of packages of convictions really satisfy our brain's desire for consistency, coherence, a sense of prediction about what's going to come.
And that's really important, I think, to explain its rise. And Promise, if I can bring you in here, aside from your PhD work, you've also written on topics such as African homophobia, militant Islam, particularly Boko Haram, military dictatorships, and all of that suggests to me that you spent a lot of time considering where extremists are sitting, where they're coming from, with a very sort of inquiring mind. And I would like to ask, is there something that you see these ideologies as having in common?
So I think these ideologies, especially I'm speaking from the African context, because I have to particularize where I'm talking about. So I think these ideas are coming from three intersecting issues. The first is the question of colonial imposition, what the colonial state represents. The second is about the capacity of the states to provide public goods and security. And then the third is about the different ideals of the state in respect to ethnic and religious identities. So you have all these three intersecting issues impacting on how people think about the legitimacy of governance, the legitimacy of the political leaders, the legitimacy of certain policies against gays, against lesbians, against particular ethnic, religious, and other regional groups. So I think if we are looking at, from an African perspective, where the origins lie in questions of political legitimacy, I think we have to take into account these three issues.
Thank you. And of course, Ayala, when people feel under threat, as they very much do in the current climate, whether it's in terms of the environment, whether it's in terms of global austerity, whether it's in terms of political instability, when people feel that kind of threat, nuance goes out the window. And of course, that's exactly what journalism is trying to bring, is the nuance. How does living in a polarized world affect the news that we get? And what can we do about it?
So polarization in society has posed many challenges to journalism, especially the kind of journalism that is most essential for democracy to function. So we know that journalism has many, many different roles, but particularly the role of monitoring those in power is one that we need for democracies to thrive. And this is one of the first things that disappears when polarized societies are facing multiple implications or ramifications of polarization. Now, I will have to start with a disclaimer that polarization in itself is not necessarily a problem. It's not always a problem. We've seen times where political scientists were warning us against the lack of political polarization, where centrist parties were too similar to one another, and we didn't have an actual democratic choice between different paths forward. This is, of course, it sounds like sci-fi at this point, having too little polarization, but just to make it one disclaimer about polarization. The second would be that polarization is often not symmetrical. And this is also important to realize, especially when we talk about journalism and how polarization affects journalism. Because for journalists who are trying to seem at least balanced and objective and impartial, it's always convenient to be in the middle. And in the middle means there is one party to your right, there is another party to your left. Or if you are in a multi-party system, you have a few parties on your right and a few parties on your left. What to do when polarization happens in an asymmetrical way and one party or one political camp drifts further and further to the right or to the left, and then journalists find themselves struggling to find their very comfortable middle or center. And another problem that happens when you have polarized audiences is that it really affects the relationship between journalists and the people and the public. We know that partisan news outlets don't have this problem, because once you have a partisan news outlet and its partisan audience, they have kind of basic trust to begin with. They have something that they share. They have a proximity because they know that ideologically they share something. This makes it very much easier for journalists to gain authority and legitimacy and credibility. But when you are a journalist who is not working for ideologically aligned news outlet, you are not working for partisan news outlet, you're working for, let's say, the BBC or other news outlets that really try to reach out to everyone. And I would argue we need those institutions, especially if, going back to our question from before, if we want to make sure that everybody knows who the next president or prime minister is, regardless of their political opinions, right? We want everyone to know, we want everyone to get these news and trust them, and in order to have political legitimacy. So journalists in the mainstream media are struggling because they don't have this affiliation with their audience. They don't have these shared ideological values that they can then build their trust on. And they need to find a different framework, a different idea of how to get closer to their audiences so that communities journalism works in feel like they are part of the community and not these fake news, enemy of the people, lefty traitors, any other smear that we hear being thrown at journalists worldwide today.
That's so interesting, because it would almost seem an advantage really to be in the middle ground, but you're saying it really isn't, and that to get closer to audiences, we have to work harder at not just balancing, but showing why we're balancing. Promise, your work has brought you closer and closer to what you term people on the ground, right? And the importance you feel of bringing everyone on board so that people feel connected to their political and social reality rather than divorced from it, disillusioned by it. As Ayala explained, sometimes that can result in everybody looking too much the same and there not being enough of a diversity of views. But can you give me an example of where you've really seen that working, when you get right in at the grassroots and not just at government level, and how we could scale something like that?
I'm doing a field work on what you might call religious terrorism in Nigeria. And I know there's a lot of question on what the right definition of terrorism is and what constitutes terrorism. Most people on the ground that I've interviewed who participated in some of these activities do not think of themselves as terrorists. They have a particular idea. I gave you 3 parts to this. I gave you the colonial imposition. So most of these groups, members of these armed groups, think of Nigeria as a state that was imposed on an already existing entity, the pre-colonial Sokoto Caliphate. And they have all these ideologies of a people who have been marginalized and their views are not taken into account. And then you also have the question of the capacity of the state to provide public goods. They question the poverty in the north, in the northern part of Nigeria, and they compare that to other parts of Nigeria, and they ask questions of why don't we have the same kinds of access to resources that other people have in other parts of Nigeria. And then they also have different ideas of the state. The state today, at least, defines itself as a secular state. And then the whole idea of Boko Haram is about Western education being forbidden, as a sin. They call it a haram. So the haram in Boko is actually a fusion of 2 entities, showing that the whole idea of Western education is forbidden, is a sin. And it's a sin because the whole idea of education, according to them, is not to improve the lives of the people in the northern part of Nigeria. This secular Western education has only been usurped by a particular fragment of the political elites who are using this to mobilize against their interests. So I think that listening to people on the ground can tell us more than what we just see from the top as just an opposition between religion and secular or elites and the common people. I think there are people on the ground who are affected, really affected by the corruption, by the lack of respect for identities, the lack of respect for human rights, and the idea that the state itself is something that could be remade in a different way that suits the interests and identities of everyone.
That's so fascinating. So when you get right down to it, the concerns that are motivating somebody who may seem very polarized, very fixed in their views, are actually very human concerns, right? I don't have the same access to goods, services, support, democracy that other people have. And that's where the anger is coming from and the entrenchment. Lior, in your research, you call that rigid thinking, right? And the opposite to that, the polar opposite to that, is something you call flexible thinking. And you really see that as a science and an art. And the most joyful news for me is that we can all retrain our brains to be flexible thinkers, right? Even if we are currently locked into one rigid point of view, one absolutely entrenched position, we can retrain our brains. Can you tell me some more about that and what the first step might be?
Yeah, so I think that in that there's already an important premise, an important idea that this kind of level of rigidity is not just a collective phenomenon, but something that rests within each of us, and each of us can decide to shift where we are on spectrums of dogmatism or spectrum of extremity. And for that, we need to understand what dogmatism or extremity is psychologically. And the way that I've like to think about it and what I write in my book is that we can think about dogmatic thinking as thinking that is resistant to updating its beliefs according to evidence. So when credible evidence is presented, the dogmatic thinker will kind of shun it or kind of ignore it or lock it away in a small part of their brain. But a flexible thinker will use that credible evidence to consider whether to update their beliefs, whether to change. And when we are within ideologies and within dogmas, we're very resistant to change or to ambiguity or to introducing kind of the shades of nuance that we talked about earlier. And so in order to try to move away each individual from rigid thinking towards flexible thinking, I think a key thing is to think about our brains as a whole, to remember that our brains are not just political brains when they encounter political information and then non-political the rest of the time. Actually, our bodies, our thoughts, our perspectives are politicized the whole way down to our bodies. And that's what this new field of political neuroscience is showing, that it's not just that when we have ideologies that influences our political perceptions, we find that actually it influences our perceptions, our cognitions, and even neutral, non-political realms of life. And so that starts to hint at the idea that if we learn or try to exercise flexibility in every aspect of our lives, in how creative we are in our personal lives and how we engage in interaction and exchange, that will kind of bleed into or creep into the flexibility with which we engage in the ideological and political sphere. So that's a kind of quick summary of a big idea, which is that our brains under ideology are changed completely. Our bodies are changed completely. And that's why it's also so important that we evaluate the stakes of our rigid ideologies, because actually they're not just operating kind of above our heads or in kind of the social marketplace of ideas. They can come and sit within us. And that's the danger, but that's also where our power rests, because we can learn to change ourselves. And I fundamentally believe that each individual is malleable. Our bodies and brains are plastic in every dimension. And that's something that we need to remember, especially when policymakers fail to protect us, that at least as individuals, we can change.
Well, that's great news because, we do only have one brain. We have to work with what we've got. We don't have to work with the states that we have, and we don't have to work with the media that we have, right? So is there any signs for either you, Ayala, or you, Promise, in terms of innovative, flexible thinking, in terms of remaking some of these systems?
Yes, sure. So I think the idea of changing ourselves and our bodies that Lior suggests really links to the main point that I'm making in my book, which is that we need to take responsibility over our media environment. There was this moment in time where we believed that after the media was out of the direct control of authoritarian rulers and there is this new marketplace of ideas, things will just work out, right? The market will solve this, it will be fine. There are journalistic norms, there are financial incentives to please the audiences. It will solve itself out. And I think by now it's pretty clear that we need to rethink and reshape the way that information gets to us in order for us to ever change our minds about anything based on reliable information. And I think for many years, the debate has been focused and obsessed with a very US-centric freedom of speech framework rather than the public's right to know framework in terms of our right as people, as journalists, as policymakers, to know what matters, to our right for useful, relevant, reliable information. And in this context, there is actually a lot that we can do. And the populist campaign against the media in many countries is actually a very good inspiration, because for many years now, politicians, parties, movements, organizations, NGOs have been working to transform our information environment. And in many countries, they've done so very successfully. And what we need to do is to make sure that each and every one of us have our ideology when it comes to media. We have our media becomes a political issue, that we all know, that we ask our representatives to make sure they promise a better information environment for us in the future. So turning media into a political issue that we are all involved in and that we all work in. Make sure we provide journalists and news organizations that are doing important work for democracy. We provide them support. This has many different faces, of course. And also the less pleasant face of it is making sure that those who pollute the information environment and those who pretend to provide us news but are actually disinforming and misinforming the public are paying the price for it. And then there are incentives for media and news organizations, journalists to grant us the information that we deserve and that we need for our democracies to function.
Thank you, Ayla. I know you call that in your book democratically engaged journalism, which, for journalists who are told from their very first day, you are not the story, you're not allowed to insert yourself in this story. It's a hard ask to suddenly step forward and say, no, we're going to make a media that represents us, that reflects us, that we deserve. But I think it's a very powerful call. What about you, Promise? Have you seen flexible thinking at work? I'm looking at the stats of this mega election year across the globe. There are 19 presidential and parliamentary elections across Africa in 2024. That's by far the biggest number in any region. But there's also been 9 coups in the last 4 years across Africa. So there's a real moment, I'm reading, of it could pull in many different directions. But where's the flexible thinking happening?
So actually, first of all, I'm not a fan of binary oppositions between what is rigid and what is flexible thinking. I think thinking is thinking. And people think in different ways, and they are free to imagine political possibilities. I say it in relation to the coup that you mentioned. So with some kind of like Eurocentric mindset, a lot of people condemn these coups. Even Nigeria tried to intervene to change the political system. But what did people on the ground actually want? Many people in these countries were jubilating. They were happy that the coups happened, right? So this was a kind of a disconnect between what people were thinking about these coups from an external Eurocentric perspective and what the people who were inside the continent, people who had faced some of these regimes, wanted. So I don't think the rigid flexible binary is going to help us understand what people need. I think what we need to do is to listen. I use this metaphor of conversation. We need to talk to people about what their real problems are and look at what organizes those thoughts. I think anthropology gives us this route to think in a diverse way, that societies vary, cultures vary, political systems vary, and the reasons why people respond to different things in different ways might not be based on the rigid, flexible dichotomy, but on the fact of certain empirical fact that they themselves alone are living. And I think most people react to issues based on certain lived experiences that they've got. This is not to undermine the impact of the media or the impact of other broad extraneous factors. But I think it's important that we have an encounter with the people that we are talking about rather than sitting from the armchair to create certain theories and apply to people who think we know.
I love that word, encounter, Promise, because that feels like something very real rather than this sort of possibly slightly fuzzy noise that we're all living with across our media landscapes and whatnot. An encounter suggests actually taking time and sitting down and listening, as you say, having a real conversation. We're racing towards the end, which is always horrible, but I do need you to all send us away with something practical that we can do in this crucial mega electoral cycle, how can we strengthen political legitimacy in the world we're in right now? Take us away, Ayala.
So I would start with understanding that no matter what is the political cause that you are dedicated to, no matter what your goal is in political activism, if we don't have a way to communicate properly, it just wouldn't work. Whether it's climate change, whether it's any other thing, you have a cause, you need to fix our media environment for that. So I would say on the very individual level, make sure you spread good quality information that you find reliable and useful. Make sure that if you can, you pay for and contribute and donate to news organizations that are doing important work. We might think they will always be there, but they might not be. We've seen this all around the world, where populist governments are curbing press freedom and news organizations shut very quickly. So even those of us who feel like we live in very safe democracies should probably be more active about how we support journalists under attack, news organizations, and how we work to make information a right that our representatives understand they need to secure for us, and pushing them and pressuring them to make sure we have great information in the future. Otherwise, every other cause we might have will just not work.
Thank you. What about you, Promise?
So, my thinking is that we should start getting rid of certain assumptions that our life worlds are built on, and begin to really engage people on the ground, talking to them. And there are different ways of engaging with people. We could, go there, live with them a bit. We can, have an experience and an encounter that we probably have never had. We could, watch movies with subtitles from different parts of the world. Once you watch some movies with subtitles, you could see how different people are living in different places. We could also travel with novels. Novels that are not just based on the Eurocentric kind of novels. Certain novels can take us away from the particular experiences that we think we've got, and to help us to engage the other life worlds of other people. So I think we have to find practical ways of encountering the other. And I talk about this in terms of a conversation. And that conversation is not only on social media, it's also on through novels, through travels, through discourses, and the whole media platform could actually create that framework for us to encounter one another.
I love that suggestion, Promise, to sort of read out and read deeper, because I'm a literature person myself, and that idea that foreign cultures that are foreign to us, teach us empathy, because it teaches us how to examine somebody else from their world in the moment of reading a book or watching a film. That is something that is so tremendously needed. Lior, let's finish with you. How do we exercise our brains right now?
I think that building on what Promise and Ayala said, I think in addition to rethinking how we encounter our media environments, our information environments, and how we encounter others and how we empathize or see our failures of empathy or gaps in our empathy, I think that what we really need is to learn to encounter ourselves anew, in the sense that I think we need to really interrogate our own dogmas, our own rigidities. I think we're often very proud to say that we have strong convictions and principles that we're really proud of and that we'll die by and that we'll, really passionately fight for. But often those conceal all kinds of rigidities that actually could do with softening or at least re-examining. And I think that if we are all more honest with ourselves about the dogmas that we hold, we have a better chance of encountering others in a more productive way. We have a better chance of learning where the dangers are that we must protect, where in our information system, our information diet, we're lacking. And I think that ultimately that helps us become more pluralistic in our thinking, more flexible in our thinking, and thinking in ways that aren't so dystopic or utopic that they pull us away from the realities in which we live, so that we can have hope that is not ideological, but that is ambitious for who we are as societies, as individuals, so that we find that balance between having political legitimacy, but not the homogeneity that can also stifle and create more dogmas. So that's my position.
Well, that's it for this episode. So huge thanks to my guests today. Lior Zmigrod, political psychologist and neuroscientist. Ayala Paniewski, Presidential Fellow in the Journalism Department at City, University of London, Research Associate 2 at the Sociology Department at the University of Cambridge, and Research Fellow at the Centre for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy in Jerusalem. And also to my final guest, Promise Frank Ejiofor, PhD candidate at the Centre of Development Studies at the University of Cambridge and a member of Queen's College. You've all made me feel a great deal more hopeful about our power to think and communicate and connect differently today. My thanks too to producers Mandy Garner from Gates Cambridge and Nick Saffel from the Central Communications Office at the University of Cambridge, who make all this happen every time. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. We're brand new, so do let us know what you think. I'm Catherine Galloway, and this was So Now What with Gates Cambridge. Join us again next time for another wicked problem dissected by those determined to do something about it.